Welcome to Planet Poet, Words in Space. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and my guests today are award-winning poets Carey Salerno and Stacy Spencer, here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Alice James Books, an important press dedicated to poetry. And here's a little information about both Carey and Stacy. Carey Salerno is the executive director and publisher of Alice James Books. She is the author of Shelter, 2009, and Tributary, 2021. And her poems, essays, and articles about her work as a publisher can be found in places like American Poetry Review, NPR, the New York Times. She has poems forthcoming in the Alaska Quarterly Review, the Los Angeles Review, and Only Poems. Carey Salerno serves as the co-chair for LitNet, the literary network, and occasionally teaches poetry and publishing arts at the University of Maine at Farmington. In 2021, she received the Golden Colophon Award for Independent Paradigm Publishing from CLMP for the leadership and contributions of Alice James Books in indie literature. And Stacy L. Spencer is a poet, fiction writer, and nonprofit consultant. After attending the Interlochen Arts Academy, where she studied with Jack Driscoll, she graduated from Amherst College and received her doctorate from the University of Michigan in American Studies. At Amherst, she won the Colin Armstrong Poetry Prize. Her positions in New York City nonprofits, where she focused on fundraising, include Barnard College, the Public Theater, the Apollo Theater, and the Museum of the City of New York. Stacy has also taught arts management at the Leuven School of Business at Pace University. And since 2016, Stacy has served on the board of Alice James Books. Her poems have appeared in Thumble Literary Magazine, Topical Poetry, and Detroit Lit Mag. Stacy is currently writing a novel. That's a lot. Oh boy. Hi, Carey. Hi, Stacy. How are you today? Thank you so much for being on the show.
Hi, it's good to be here.
It's great to see you again. I know, Stacy, it's my pleasure to meet Carey for the first time.
And likewise, Carey, Sharon, thank you so much.
You're welcome. And Carey, before you begin telling us about Alice James Books, here's a quote from NPR. Alice James Books is one of the pure sources of American poetry, an independent publisher of nothing but poetry that has started the careers of too many poets to name. So would you introduce us to Alice James Books, Carey?
Absolutely. Yeah, and thank you so much for having us and for your question. That quote that you gave from NPR, I think is also from Craig Teicher, a beloved poet and friend. So thank you for that. It's always a nice reminder. So Alice James is, as you mentioned, just celebrating our 50th anniversary. We were founded in 1973 in Boston, Massachusetts by 7 people, 5 women and 2 men, who were part of a writing group together. And at that time, the women in that group were finding that their poems were being rejected largely across the board by editors who, of course, were largely all men at that time, and receiving rejection letters that would say things like, if only you were writing about, other topics, or if you were, writing so much like a woman, we might publish this. And there was a real sense of frustration in the group about those responses, about the dynamic in publishing at that time. And so that writing group, those individuals started Alice James. And at that time, they were starting the press in order to give women a voice because they were being marginalized. And so that's sort of like the foundation of the press. It was founded as a cooperative, so every single individual at the press performed work for the press. And some of the greatest archival items that we have are some photographs of the founders typesetting by oil lamplight, text, yes, in
Beautiful.
books at MIT Press, in the middle of the night when they were allowed to use the printing presses there. And so certainly we have this very collaborative approach, in our roots that we continue to carry forth today. We were founded to give individuals who are from historically marginalized groups voice in poetry. And, initially that began with women, but we've extended that mission further and further and further as we've gone along in the years. Our founding principles are those of access and excellence and inclusivity and belonging. And those are sort of the pillars that drive the work that we do at the press on a day-to-day basis. And you mentioned that we are a publisher of solely poetry, which is true. And we are one of the first houses in the country to be dedicated to poetry solely. So I'm trying to think of what else to say. That's it for now,
Yeah,
I think.
I remember 1973. It was very difficult for it was a different world actually 50 years ago, and the press helped make it different. Would you tell me a little bit about who Alice James is? Because it's
Yes,
such a great it's so great that the press chose her as the name of the press for her name.
yes. And I think, Sharon, that it was a really fitting name for the press because of the difficulties that Alice James faced. So, for those who are not familiar with Alice James, she was the sister of philosopher William James and novelist Henry James, and they were both celebrated writers,
Hmm.
celebrated for their talents. But certainly, Alice was no exception to those talents. However, she was not given the same educational opportunities as her brothers. According, it was very common during that time to when you were a woman not to be given the same kinds of
Right.
opportunities as men or boys in the family. So Alice's gift for writing really went underrecognized during her lifetime, unacknowledged even. But she did write. She was a journalist, and she did write extensively and very philosophically about life. Her journal, her diary is very interesting, and was she really felt the intensity of the pain of that marginalization, and you
Oh,
can see that
yes.
in her writing as well. It was very unfortunate. She died of breast cancer in 1892. Um,
She was 43, I understand.
so
Very
young,
young.
just so young. But the sense, when as I spoke about the reasons for the founding of the press, and we think about, what Alice James endured, you can see a lot of the resonance between her struggles and the struggles that the women were facing at the time that the press was founded. And so that's really how Alice James, became a representation for the press and the namesake for the press.
Thank you, Carrie. Carrie, would you read a poem by Betsy Scholl and just briefly tell us who she is?
Yes, yes. So Betsy Scholl is one of the founders of the press. And I'd like to read this poem if this is one of the first books that the press published in 1974. And this is one of Betsy's first books as well. And Betsy is a poet from Maine. She's a former poet laureate of Maine. She's an Alice James founder. She's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant poet. This certainly is not her only book. And I encourage everyone to check out her other books in addition to this one. I'm going to read a poem from the book. It's called Changing Faces. But read her extensively. She's amazing.
Thank you.
This poem is called The Same Elegy Never Completed. Each Day It's a Different Death. For My Father by Betsy Scholl. Your life is over before mine begins, like some electrical implantation that leaves just the idea of you. I used to know the difference between you and all the dead presidents, you, and all the dead miners who were illiterate and drunk by 6:30, the people who did not die at their desks, well dressed and in control of things. When the car broke down in a snowstorm just outside Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, I wanted to feel at home. Nothing of us may ever reach the stars, but all the flowers in the Trenton graveyard have had their fill of you.
That's Carey Salerno reading The Same Elegy Never Completed Each Day. It's a Different Death by Betsy Scholl. That's a very long title. It's a very succinct poem. That it's so clear and poignant. There is contrast throughout the poem, the stars in the Trenton graveyard, and the well-dressed people and the people who don't die at their desks. It's quite beautiful, and it was written in 1974, you said, but
Yes.
it's so clear. It feels like it's timeless. Like it could be written to today.
Right.
It's so direct. Stacy, you can comment too.
Yeah,
Looking
hi.
at you. Hello.
I'm just like really impressed by this poem. It feels so simple, and yet there is
Yes.
just so much packed into such a very short amount of words, such a small number of words. It's just like in the emotion that is so simply stated, just the clarity, and yet it's complex at the same time. It's so impressive.
It sort of swoons with emotion, and you did a beautiful reading of it, Carrie. Thank
Thank
you. And Stacy, I wanted to ask you, what led you to join the board of
Well,
Alex James Books?
yeah, I was asked to join the board in it was 2016, right, Carrie? So it's been a few years. It's so I feel like I'm really starting to be at home there. It takes a little while. But yeah, I was in a point in my life where I had studied poetry when I was young and had written when I was younger, and then just sort of the I don't know, the carrying, being carried away by life, I guess. I got kind of drifted away from that first love. So I was looking to get back into the poetry world. I was sort of sort of in middle age and wanting to return, and I had started writing poetry again, very tentatively at first, and finding my way. And I was just starting to feel like I was getting a bit of a toehold, and it was surprised me. I sort of through a sort of a mutual friend, somebody that is a friend of mine and somebody who is known to the press. She connected us, and they invited me to join the board. My background, my professional background is in nonprofit fundraising mostly, but I've also taught nonprofit management. So that seemed to be a really good fit. That is
Yes.
Carrie mentioned, the press was started as a collective, and the editorial board and the business of the organization were really one and the same thing. But over time, I think this is before I joined the board, it was I think a realization that it might function or grow better if there was a split between the artistic side and the business side, which is generally good practice. And so when I was asked to join, I joined the business board, the sort of management board. There's still an editorial board, completely separate. So like the board that I'm on doesn't make any artistic decisions. That's done by Carey, who's the executive editor, and with the consultation of her editorial board. But I was really pleased to be able to bring some of those skills that I developed over the years with fundraising and figuring out how to put together a board and those kinds of things, and to
Those
bring
are
it.
very, very, very
Say,
important skills
yeah.
for a successful, for a nonprofit to be successful. It also doesn't hurt that you're an award-winning poet, Stacy, and a very fine poet that
Well, thank you.
I
Thank you. I
Stacy,
appreciate
would
that.
you introduce a poem by another Alice Alice James poet, Jane Mead?
Sure. I would like to read a poem by one of I think one of our leading poets, Jane Mead. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2019, so she's no longer with us. She was the author of 5 collections of poetry, The World of Made and Unmade, with Alice James in 2016, was nominated for the National Book Award, as well as a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize and the Griffin Prize in Poetry. So she was quite a celebrated poet. And the poem that I would like to read is from Money, 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 Water, Water, Water. Uh,
Great title.
it's a great title, and it's a delicate, beautiful work of eco poetry. It's really about our destruction of the lovely blue planet that we live on, and it's multi-layered. Each of the poems is structured so that there's a poem, and then on the opposite page there's like a little almost aphoristic commentary, which I mean, they don't fit together in really super obvious ways. So it's a dialogue or a monologue, depending on whether you want to see these as one voice or 2 voices or multiple voices. I'm going to read just,
How interesting that is.
it's really
Unusual.
fascinating.
Yeah.
The poem that I'm going to read is called The Geese. And the title is sort of part of the poem. It leads right into the poem. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to, rather than sort of reading the title separately, I'm just going to go, right into the poem. The geese, slicing this frozen sky, know where they are going and want to get there. Their call, both strange and familiar, calls to the strange and familiar heart. And the landscape becomes the landscape of being, which becomes the bright silos and snowy fields over which the nuanced and muscular geese are calling.
Mm, it's beautiful. That's Stacy Spencer reading the Geese by Jane Mead from Money, 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 Water, Water, Water. And it's so interesting that she calls the geese muscular. I find that so interesting. I mean, the poem is has a lot of flight to it. I think it moves beautifully, but there is a lot of meat to it and repetition.
Right. There's a lot of movement in this poem, right,
Yes.
Carey?
Yes.
Carey, you want to jump in and talk about this a little bit? You edited this, so you can maybe tell us a little more about the background.
Yes, I think one of the one of the elements of Mead's poetry that I've always admired is the way that she can um, capture moments in time that maybe are small but are incredibly expansive in a very economical way. And in this poem in particular, we feel very intensely the continuity and perpetuity of the movement that is happening above the
Yes.
speaker.
Yeah, there's a lot of repetition, which doesn't make it static. For some reason, it moves it along.
Yes,
Yes. Yeah.
It's very beautiful. Very
it's
beautiful.
very elegant.
It's
It
very,
is. I can see now a pattern of Alice James poets have a certain elegance to them.
Well,
So,
I am sure they
yes.
will all be so happy to hear that.
Oh, I'm very impressed. It's beautiful, beautiful work.
Thank
Stacey,
you.
would you read another poem by one of another of Alice James poets?
Yeah, I'd be very pleased to talk about another poet from the press. I'm going to turn to Philip B. Williams, a poem from his debut book called Thief in the Interior, which was published in 2016, the same year that I joined the board. And he's a really different poet than Jane, and I chose it because I wanted to get a range of different to get a sense of different the range of what we do over at the press. Williams is Black and he's gay, and his book is really about, it's really embedded in that experience. His poems are very specific about the kinds of particular pain that he has gone through. We talked at the beginning of the interview about our original women poets and how they struggled to find their voices, their poetic voices, and to speak in that world. And he's struggling in his own way in some of the, through some of that same kind of, I don't know, thick bramble, trying to get his voice out. The reason I chose the poem that I did is that, like Jane Mead's poem, it's embedded in the natural world. And so for me, it speaks to me very deeply because it is a poem about the natural world, which I'm attracted to. And it has some of interestingly, I feel like it has some touchstones with her poem. And it's also a poem that where it speaks about the things that he's talking about in the rest of the book. It's not quite as explicit. And so I feel that for me to be reading it, it makes a little more sense. And this poem is called Luminous Whatever Honey. I go to twist the knob of a burning skull that burns because the canyon sun has touched curve after curve of the hard soiled thing into luminosity, as though veins ran courses around the buffered ivory of socket and tooth, rounded where thinking broke loose. Coyote skull, fox skull, I'm too ignorant to know. The elaborate bones circled by opulence, cactus blossoms, a beetle's green carapace. My thumb falls into where the sight's gone hollow. My fingers fondle the spinal gap for whatever sap's left over in the desiccated jaw. Whatever honey was eaten has calcified, as though hunger has frozen under skin, overthought in the tremble of my hand.
Ah, wow. That's Stacy Spencer reading Philip B. Williams' poem, The Luminous Whatever Honey. That's so powerful. And it is the natural world that has a totally different sense of weight. It's weighty and it's more static, but that's a wrong word for it because it has so much internal life to it. Beautiful imagery.
It also does, it
Wonderful.
uses repetition in some of
Yes.
the ways that she does, the burning skull that burns curve after curve.
Mhm.
I feel like there's also a lot of movement in this poem. Not so much maybe literal movement like with the geese moving, but there's certainly a lot of, there's music here that moves it along.
Yes.
It's
It-
really fun. It's a really pleasurable poem to read out loud. It feels very
Meaty. It's meaty.
full. Yeah,
Yeah.
full in the
It's
mouth.
full.
Full.
Yeah. And also it has the feeling of bone, it moves, it has that feeling of bone to it. And it's so interesting because he interjects in the middle. Is it coyote skull, fox skull? I'm too ignorant to know. But what he does know and what he shares with the reader is pretty intense.
Yeah, pretty profound.
It is wonderful. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say he turns it's like the ugliness is burning bright, and it's a way of, I think a lot of his work, as I understand it, it's like trying to find the transcendence, trying to find the beauty of life and in the pain,
Mm-hmm.
or move through the pain to find that. And that's sort of the thrust, I think, of his work.
Yeah.
Um, at least as I understand it, or a piece of his work. He's a poet who's struggling, and I really like that.
And I have a note here. We talked about the opulence of the language, and he actually says the elaborate bones circled by opulence. And I don't know if he meant to refer to his own writing, but it certainly echoes that. Beautiful. You're listening to Planet Poet Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio, live and local in the Catskills. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, here with my guests, poets Stacy Spencer and Carey Salerno of Alice James Books. To open the second section of the show, we're going to concentrate a little bit on Stacy's journey as a poet and her wonderful poems. And I would ask you to start us off with a poem, Ragged Mountain. Stacy.
Yeah, sure, Sharon, I would love to. I'm going to read Ragged Mountain, which is a poem that I wrote right after 1/6/2021, the Capitol attack, of course. I was in Maine at the time. It was the pandemic, and I was up in a farmhouse way out in the country and watching all of that. And so this poem is really responding to that moment. Ragged Mountain. Everything these days seems to bleed. The sky goes all rose-colored at 4. A thin stripe hangs over the rolling land. Heavy rain has washed away the snow. A moose bobbles in the car window, its fur a sheen of brown fuzz. I keep forgetting names. The guns reverberate from the range down by the boat launch. The sharpness is softened only slightly by the piney jut of woods between them and us. I stepped on a hornet's nest right there once. They swarmed and stung. I've never returned again to that spot, despite the draw of a rare sand cove nestled against the curving lake, the thrust of Ragged Mountain beyond.
Thank you, Stacy. That's Stacy Spencer reading her poem, Ragged Mountain. It sort of blends with the other poems, so it fits right in. All the nature poetry and the intensity of your language. Where is Ragged Mountain?
It's in the mid-coast area of Maine. It's right off near Camden, Maine. It's an actual mountain. And I can see it from my house. It's not a huge mountain. It's more a large hill, I guess I would say. But it's craggy. You can see the shape of the mountain is rather jagged or rough at the edges.
It's beautiful language, Stacy, and I love the way you use past and present in the poem. You go from everything these days seems to bleed, which is an incredible opening line, and without the reference to what happened on January 6th, there's still resonance there. I love a moose bobbles in the car window, and I've never returned again to that spot. So there's a longing there. Quite lovely. Thank you. There's another poem. There's called The Burdock. That would be great if you read for us.
Sure. The Burdock. The burdock made its appearance in July among the ferns under the old apple tree. By August, it was 5.5 feet tall, gawking and sharp. Pulling it up would have required tools. We left it alone. Now in autumn, it is a bleak thing. The groove stalk has turned woody. Its once magenta thistles have dried up and opened out, leaving the sticky burrs it is famous for. Curious valentines these, faded yet spiked with fecundity. I tear off a great hooked leaf, turning brown at the edges. Stiff as burlap, it crumples in my hand. There are other leaves still attached, each angling off this figure that strikes me as all too human.
That's The Burdock by Stacy Spencer. I don't know what a burdock is, but now I think I do. I didn't know before I read the poem or heard you read the poem. Could you tell us a little bit about what made you write that poem? I mean, it's so like you're taking nature and putting it under a magnifying glass.
Yeah, I think it was a self-imposed exercise of looking at something really closely and just seeing what you see there. The burdock is burdocks are you probably do know what they are, you just don't know the name. They're those great big weeds that grow in the country
Uh-huh.
or in lots even in the city that are they grow really large, and they have these big ugly, they're very unattractive, and they have these big stalks, and they're sharp if you touch them. When they get very large, you're going to cut your hand. And they're if you walk through the countryside, and you get like all those sticky things all over you, that's what they're
The
just
burrs, yeah.
the burrs.
I love when you say curious Valentines. That's that's really wonderful. That they are. I think they're beautiful the way you describe them, Stacy. And so, tell me a little bit more about their nature poetry that you write. Is that a theme in your poetry?
I would say so. Yeah, it's something that that I definitely seem to pay a lot of attention to. Um, yeah, I think so. Some of my poetry is, I mean, not particularly the ones that I'm reading today, but some of it is more about, the concern with loss, with what we're losing so
Yeah,
rapidly in our
yeah.
world. So some of the poems that I've been working on lately are more, really about the pain of lose of what is going away from us, like really almost as we're watching it.
It's unbearable. So, how do you write about the unbearable? So this is the autumn without it actually being the season. Now in autumn, it is a bleak thing. So it's a very slanted way of talking about it. But there's a lot of sadness in the poem, and I guess the harshness of the burdock. Anything else you'd like to say about the poem? Or
I guess
Carrie, if you'd like to say anything about what Stacy's been reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that really strikes me is Stacy has this really unique and beautiful ability to go deeply into nature and
Mhm.
her surroundings and create a discourse around what we're facing as a society. So it's not, and that comes in together with what we're losing as well. And it really makes me think about what we're doing as individuals and as a collective together, in direct opposition to our own best interests.
Mhm.
And I think that's what Stacey really brings to the forefront in her work. It's incredibly remarkable.
Yes. And Stacy, you have another poem for us. It's called Bees in the Spirea.
right.
Could you tell us first what a spirea is?
It's a kind of flowering bush
Okay,
that blossoms in late spring.
great.
Yeah, they're fragrant. They're clusters. I guess they can come in other colors, but usually the ones I'm familiar with are white, and they're little cluster. They're like balls, like almost like snowballs. With
Uh-huh,
little
uh-huh.
flowers, and they're very fragrant. And a kind of very pretty, kind of floral fragrant, not a heavy scent, but a very pretty scent. This poem, Bees in the Spirea, was written as it's a little different, I think, than most of my other poetry. I wrote during the pandemic. I wrote a series of poems in real time as the pandemic was
Mhm.
unfolding. So this is one of those poems, and it was written in mid-June, which is, just a few months after the pandemic had started. What makes, I think, it different than my other poems is that there's a kind of almost, I almost want to say nursery rhyme quality, not necessarily this poem so much, but some of the other poems. And I found that I had like poetic structure that kind of wanted to assert itself in these poems that I don't usually use rhyme or really any particular structure, but a lot of these poems do have internal rhyme or various kinds of rhyme, and it just sort of happened. I didn't intend that to happen, and I think it was a process of trying to assert some kind of control over, a really chaotic and frightening situation, which I found in retrospect, wasn't aware of it at the time really, but in retrospect, I find that kind of interesting, how poetry can really become a way of structuring an experience so that we can manage it a little bit better. We can understand it, take it apart and put it back together and understand it a little bit better.
I like that.
Yeah, so this is Bees in the Spirea. It is mid-June, and the bees in the spirea, catching light like snow, are barely audible in the great bent branches. A shell can speak of the sea. The hill we are perched on speaks of the valley inverted. A peach pit is not a precious object, yet it sits in the eater's hand as damp and wizened as a newborn child. The bees stay in motion. They will move on next to the trellised vine whose scarlet blossoms are about to open. They will be slender with a frill of lighter gold. The woody stems will dig in with a firm hold. We, in this strange moment in spring, 20 years into the millennium, have dug into, speaking our fears as we go about our lives. The lilacs have passed. The spirea thrives.
So you wrote this from the beginning of spring in 2020. How long did this project last for you?
I started in March, right at the beginning, and then I think my last poem was like the beginning of 2021, right around the time that the Ragged Mountain was written, but that wasn't really part of that series. Yeah, and so it's a small group of poems. And some of them are a little strange, they're a little surreal, which is not really what I typically really do. I usually kind of aim for clarity
Right.
and precision. And some of them are really weird. I mean, there are things like, I don't know what they mean. I don't know what, they really carried on by the music. So it was a weird time, right? And
It was. So you actually the surrealness of the time is the reality, and that's what that's what needed to be worked with. No, I love a peach pit is not a precious object, yet it sits in the eater's hand as damp and wizened or wizened as a newborn child. It's so weird to say that a newborn child is wizened, but it's true. A newborn can be like a wrinkly piece of fruit.
red and wrinkly, yeah.
So it's so evocative. I just find it so poignant. Have you been thinking of putting these together?
I have. I put together the pandemic poems into a kind of, I guess you'd call it a chapbook.
I would like to ask both of you, and Carey, you can start us off talking about what's on the horizon for Alice James Books and the anniversary. I think the anniversary has been going on, correct?
73. So we are wrapping up our anniversary year and moving into the next future phase of Alice James and our work. Yet the celebrations continue. And one of the big things that's coming up for us in April is the publication of the new and collected poems of Jean Valentine.
Oh.
That collection is called Light Me Down and features a healthy selection of new poems by Jean, and exciting news on that front as well for her poems. One of the poems will be featured in a forthcoming issue of the New Yorker as well. So I hope all the listeners will be on the lookout for that. And we have a host of really beautiful books coming up this year, including a collection by Alicia Ostreicher, The
Mm-hmm.
Holy and Broken Bliss, Poems in
Mm.
Pandemic Time, and Joan Larkin, Old Stranger. Both of those women are just uh, magnanimous tridents of poets, and we are so proud to be in partnership with both of them on these very important books of theirs. And we have another book by debut poet Ayokunle Falomo. It's going to be a really interesting book. It's very introspective, and it really takes a deep dive into colonialism in Nigeria and identity in relation to that. Um, so in addition to those things, we're continuing to grow our audiobooks program. We are getting ready to launch our Jean Valentine series, which will be a new series of publication that is dedicated to supporting mid-career women identifying writers who still are not receiving the kinds of opportunities that are out there necessarily for debut poets
Mm.
or other individuals. And we're continuing to grow our support services to our writers, which is really important to us. It's part of our work. So not only are we publishing poets, but we're trying to find ways to support them more thoroughly in their endeavors as writers.
Mm.
So it's not just about getting the book printed, it's about all of the things that come with being a writer. What does that mean for them? And how can we enhance their experience as a poet and give them more tools to be successful as a poet and in their writing?
So this is sounds a rare opportunity for your writers.
Yes, we are really excited by the possibilities, especially as we've brought in two new individuals into the fold at the press. We have an in-house publicist now for the first time dedicated to Alice James books. So we're getting, really great in-depth attention to our books in-house, about how and where we can publicize and pitch them. And we also have an individual who is dedicated. Her name is Lacey Dunham. She's fantastic. She's been doing such a great job, and she's dedicated to pitching our authors
Oh,
to various event venues to get them before their audiences so that they can connect with the public, they can connect with their readers, and enrich the experience of the individuals who are coming to Alice James and reading Alice James books.
that's great. Because a lot of poets, no matter how, talented or wonderful, some don't, it's hard to find events and find radio stations and find the venues to keep going with the book. To have a
Yes,
real partner, have the publisher as a real partner is wonderful and
yes.
unusual. Could you tell us a little bit about the audio division? What is that?
Yes. So we are working to help our authors if they are interested in doing it, although we encourage all of our authors to. We always want to be mindful of their capacities to perform the work. But if they're interested, we invite them to record an audio version of their book.
Mm-hmm.
And those books are made available on the same sales channels that all of the physical and ebooks are made available on. And for us at Alice James, it's a very important expansion of our publication program
Mm-hmm.
because it does reach individuals that are readers that may not be able to, for one reason or another, experience poems in a physical book or be able to read,
Yes.
if they're visually impaired. It just gives another opportunity to be more inclusive in our offerings and to acknowledge all types of readers and the way that they might approach books.
Thank you, Carrie. And I'm sure Stacy's work has a lot to do with your expansion of the press or your
It
business
does.
acumen and your probably brainstorming. But it's in this day and age to have that kind of expansion and excitement and support of the poets is it's very heartening, very heartening. And Carey, would you take us out with a poem by Sarah Ghazal Ali?
I would love to read this poem by Sarah. The poem is called Shirk, and it is from her collection Theophanies, which just released in January from Alice James. She will actually be in Western Massachusetts in April at the Juniper Literary Festival. So if any of the listeners are looking to hear her live, you might be able to catch her at that time. I
Wonderful.
hope that's okay to add that
Oh,
information in.
absolutely. Actually, before you read, if you could give us some information about if our listeners want more information on Alice James books, where they can go and to find out about all these opportunities and the events, would you just
Yes.
let us know?
Yes. So if you would like to learn more about Alice James books, you can always visit our website, www.alicejamesbooks.org. We do have a really active Instagram account, and we try to keep up with all of our authors as best as we can in terms of their forthcoming events. And so you'll see events from us and from our authors frequently on that channel as well. And you'll also be able to, from our Instagram account, Alice James Books, be able to connect out further with our individual authors who are in our followers list or have been tagged in our various posts. So I hope you'll check us out. We're also on Facebook, and I guess it's X now, but I'm still going to call it Twitter if those are your preferred channels.
Thank you, Carey. And now on to Shirk.
Yes, this is Shirk by Sarah Ghazal Ali. Years after our end, I looked up the meaning of his name. Enveloping sky. In the Quran, the sky is at one point cloth tented over bare dirt. At another, a ceiling vaulting the tender bed of the earth from comets or acid rain, solar flares, alluring guests. And he restrains the sky from falling on a girl bright-haired and eager to sweat in a non-god's bed, unless by his permission. He asked before entering, and I gave permission. To say otherwise a lie, though one God allows with private remorse, as in bitten again, a morsel of flesh ripped from me, acre dewing at the lip of a wound, juice from the first apple slicking the mouth of the first man. I was penitent, but not before he entered again and again the Lord. I briefly believed. His body above me an eclipse, a spectacle I'd been warned not to watch.
Amazing. That is Carey Salerno reading Shirk by, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, could you say it's Sarah Ghazal Ali? Very intense. All I can say is thank you so much for a great show and all the wonderful poetry from Alice James Books and the spectacular poetry of Stacy Spencer. And I've learned so much, and I'm in such awe of all the beautiful work I've heard today and your wonderful discussion about it. Thank you so much, Carey
Thank you.
Salerno and Stacy Spencer, both of the director. Carey, you're the executive director of Alice James Books and superb board member of Alice James Books, Stacy Spencer. And
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening.